The first candles guttered in the summer rain, tiny flames bowing to warm wind off the Atlantic. Ocean Drive was a smear of patrol lights and umbrellas, sidewalks slick as mirrors. People stood shoulder to shoulder outside a wrought iron gate, faces turned toward a stone staircase that would never be walked the same way again. Reporters whispered. Tourists held their breath. Somewhere beyond the tape, the steps of Casa Casuarina still held the dark memory of gunfire. Gianni Versace had started that morning with a familiar ritual, July 15, 1997. He left his mansion, walked past the palms, and strolled to the news cafe for coffee and magazines. He had come home to Miami after a triumphant season in Europe. The brand that bore his name was a living thunderclap. He returned unguarded, smiling, carrying glossy pages under his arm, wearing the ease of a man who had outrun storms and built color out of chaos. 2 shots cracked the heat. The first slammed into the back of his head at close range. The second followed an instant later. He fell bleeding onto the coral stone steps beneath the Medusa crest that crowned his gate. His partner, Antonio D'Amico, ran outside screaming. Neighbors froze. A man peeled away from the scene, calm and quick, and vanished toward an alley. Witnesses would remember the cap, the gray shirt, the deliberate pace. On the landing, 2 .40 caliber shell casings glinted against stone. Paramedics fought for minutes that felt like hours. Sirens carved the humidity. Gianni Versace was pronounced dead at Jackson Memorial Hospital. Word spread along Ocean Drive, then across Miami Beach, then around the world faster than the storm clouds could gather. People wept into their phones. Designers called each other in disbelief. The street outside the mansion became a shrine of lilies and cameras. The man who ran was not a stranger to death. Andrew Cunanan, age 27, had already left 4 bodies across 3 states. In April, he had beaten Jeffrey Trail to death in Minneapolis with a hammer. He fled with David Madsen, who was found shot days later on the shore of Rush Lake. In May, in Chicago, Lee Miglin was discovered in his garage, bound and murdered with savage precision. A week later, a cemetery caretaker named William Reese was shot in New Jersey. Cunanan took Reese's red pickup and disappeared. He was handsome, mercurial, a teller of grand stories that dissolved under daylight. He charmed, then he destroyed. By July, the FBI had his name and his face on wanted posters, but Miami is a maze when it wants to be. And Cunanan had already touched the city. A pawnshop ticket would prove it. Florida law required a thumbprint for any pawned item. Earlier that month, a man using the name Kurt DeMars pawned a rare gold coin stolen from Miglin. The print on that slip matched Andrew Cunanan. He had walked Miami's streets before the murder, and no one had known. Back on Ocean Drive, the rain returned. A warm shower that pinned wilted flowers to the sidewalk. Detectives from Miami Beach and federal agents stood beneath awnings and conferred in low voices. They had 2 smoking brass casings and a witness trail heading north. They had a city full of eyes. They had a luxury truck abandoned in a parking garage not far away. When they opened it, they found clothes, newspapers, and an ID in a false name. The red pickup that belonged to William Reese had carried Cunanan to Miami. It would now carry his ghost through every conversation on the beach. The autopsy on Versace confirmed what the staircase already knew. A .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol at close range. Contact and near-contact wounds. No time to react. No final words. The medical examiner spoke in careful terms, each sentence a gray stone set in place. The ballistics team compared striations and impressions. When they finally found Cunanan, they would make the match. But for now, the killer was a rumor with a photograph. The city tightened. Helicopters scissored the sky. Patrol cars idled at intersections. Residents checked the locks twice. The Versace family retreated into grief. Donatella would later shoulder the empire with a jaw set like steel, but on those first nights she was a sister, and the house that had been a party became a mausoleum. The search for Andrew Cunanan turned the waterways into chessboards. Miami Beach is ridged with canals and inlets where a man can hide with a little luck and a lot of nerve. On July 23rd, a caretaker noticed something wrong on a houseboat moored along Indian Creek near Collins Avenue. A broken window, a suspicious noise. Police moved in. They heard a single shot from inside. When they entered, they found Andrew Cunanan dead from a self-inflicted wound. The pistol lay by his body. The weapon told its own story. Ballistics linked that handgun to the casings on the steps of Casa Casuarina and to the bullet that killed William Reese. The line was straight, unbroken, and final. In the cabin, investigators found a small shrine to vanishing. There were newspapers and clothes, and in one bag, the residue of a life spent moving in borrowed names. There would be no trial for Gianni Versace's murder. The man who pulled the trigger had chosen the last verdict himself. Still, the justice system has rituals for grief, and Miami walked through them. In a packed hearing room, the lead detective laid out the chain of evidence. The shell casings recovered from the mansion steps, the caliber, the ejection pattern, the photographs that showed where each piece lay, the pawn slip with a thumbprint matching Cunanan, the abandoned truck tied to William Reese, the recovered handgun on the houseboat, and the ballistics that drew a tight circle around everything. Reporters scribbled. Lawyers asked how and why and when. The answer that mattered most, the one about motive, stood in the doorway and refused to come in. Outside the courthouse, rain drummed evenly on the sidewalk. A woman set a bouquet against the wall and stood watching it as if it could choose not to fall. The press wanted a narrative that made sense. Was Versace targeted for fame, for fantasy, for some grievance known only to the killer? The FBI files later described Cunanan as long slide into debt and invention and a craving for status that fed on lies. He had told friends he knew Versace, a claim the fashion house denied. The truth, in the end, was quieter and colder than rumor. A young man addicted to stories and attention found a famous man at his front door and chose a gun. The funeral was a world event. In Milan, black cars poured along wet streets that reflected cathedrals and flashbulbs. Royalty and actors and designers moved through the church in a slow current. Elton John and Sting performed "The Lord is My Shepherd." People who had only ever known Versace as a sigil on fabric cried as if they had lost a friend. In Miami, the gate at Casa Casuarina became a wall of flowers so thick the iron vanished. Late at night, after the cameras left, tourists walked past in flip-flops, and for a moment even the loud bars on Ocean Drive dimmed their music. Back in the evidence lab, technicians repeated their measurements. Distance, angle, burn marks, imprint. The science never hurries. It steps forward in patient inches. The final report was a map of a morning that would not leave. 2 shots from behind. A suspect who ran. A gun that confessed when pressed to metal. Detectives carried their binders into rooms that smelled like cold coffee and printer ink and did the last thing cases sometimes require. They reconciled. Without a living defendant, the state could not mount an indictment, but the narrative was clear and supported. The murderer had killed before. The murderer had traveled under his victims' names and in their cars. The murderer had died by his own hand with the same weapon he used on the steps of Casa Casuarina. The file would live on the shelf, not closed with a slam, but placed there with a careful hand. Years later, newcomers to Miami walk Ocean Drive and see a high wall and a familiar crest and an address that carries a weight they feel without quite knowing why. The city changed in ways that are hard to measure. Fame felt thinner. Security details got thicker. Designers looked over their shoulders more often when they stepped out for coffee. The people who loved Versace speak about color and generosity, about a man who made audacity feel like fresh air. They do not say the staircase first. They say the laughter. On some summer nights, rain still lifts the smell of stone along the block where it happened. The street shines, and the palms hiss with water and tires whisper over the asphalt. The gate is quiet. Tourists take photos and try to frame the past without letting it swallow the present. There was no final cross-examination to answer the question people kept asking. Why him? Why like this? There is only a set of facts that lead to a doorway and stop. A famous man returned from breakfast. A killer stepped out of a shadow he had been practicing for months. 2 shots. A city that held its breath, then kept breathing. The staircase remains, and the Medusa still looks outward, unmoving, unmoved. She has seen storms and parades and nights when the ocean sounds closer than it is. The lights along Ocean Drive blink and hum. The house keeps its silence. The case file sleeps in an archive drawer under fluorescent bulbs that never warm the paper. If you stand at the curb long enough, you can hear the city decide to move on. But the stone remembers what flesh cannot, and some doors never forget the last footstep that crossed them.